murder, conspiracy, code conduct unbecoming. At least one of these charges will be investigated during this video, taking a look at Dan Vega's HTTP interfaces demos as a part of Tales from the Jar Side. Okay, let's be serious a moment. Recently, Dan Vega, who produces lots and lots of videos related to the Spring Framework on his YouTube channel, produced two videos here that you can see on Spring's HTTP interface capabilities. These were added in Spring Boot 3.0 and above and are very, very helpful. It's a way to create a web client without writing anything but the interface methods. You don't have to implement any of the web client API yourself. So I was watching these videos and I thought, wait a minute, I can use part of this. I had something I wanted to look into, and that's what I want to start with. So one of the services that he used in one of his videos is this service known as JSON Placeholder. JSON Placeholder is a free fake API for testing and prototyping, and you can see the URL up here. I've always wanted a nice fake API for demos or for tests like this, because usually when you access a publicly available web service, they only support GET requests. Well, what you'll notice with this one is that it supports a whole series of routes, posts as GET requests, and post, put, patch, and delete. All of the major HTTP verbs are supported by this service. We're going to take a look at this, and Dan used it in one of his videos. I want to address that here. To show you an example, if I go inside this post one, I could do that from a browser. You see the response I get is this collection of individual JSON objects representing a blog post, basically. It's got a user ID and an ID and a title and a body. The title and the body just have some generic Latin in them. No problem. Lorem ipsum, as they say. But you can do put, patch, and delete as well, which we're going to take a look at. Let's go look at the application. Now, what I have here is a basic Spring Boot application, and I mean really simple. It is using the current version of Spring Boot 3.1.1, but the only starter I added was the WebFlux starter. The WebFlux starter includes the web client and the web client test class. I need both of those for what I'm going to do. It automatically brought in the test starter and the reactor test API because that's what the WebFlux module does. I do have, as an aside, one additional dependency, this Netty Resolver DNS native Mac OS thing. For those handful of viewers who try to run WebFlux on a Mac that has Apple Silicon in it, you get this weird DNS warning every time you run. This block in the dependencies of my Gradle build makes that warning go away. And I know most people aren't going to care about that at all, but for that handful of viewers who actually have that problem, this video just became worth watching. For the rest of the people, let's hang in there for a few minutes. So at any rate, that's all I have in here. Now, remember, I have that block of JSON data coming back. I decided to make the class called blog post, which is in fact a Java record that has an ID, a user ID, a title, and a body. Now, records are essentially immutable data holders. This is the only constructor it has. It auto-generates to string and equals and hash code. The good news is that the JSON parser built into Spring, the Jackson JSON parser, knows how to deal with records. So we're good there. Now, what I first want to do is I want to examine that RESTful web service. I want to send requests and get responses back. Now, I could do that with just a regular old HTTP client, something like curl or HTTPy, or I could use the one built into IntelliJ, but I'm going to do it in a test class because I want to show you the code that we're eventually saving. So I have here a class called JSON Placeholder Test. That's this test class, and it auto wires in a web test client. So this is a Spring Boot test on a random port, gives it access to the web, and then I'm going to use a web test client inside it. And that's a web client. I'm not going to start up a server or anything like that. I just want to run these tests. So the first thing I do is do a GET request, and this is the URL for the post endpoint. do an exchange, and I should get back an OK. I should get back a 200. In fact, I can also demonstrate that the body list is made up of, or the body rather, is made up of a list of those blog post instances of size 100. So that's very nice that I can demonstrate that. To check the post that exists, I have a test here that goes with the range I know about, the IDs from 1 to 100. And for each one, I'm going to invoke a GET request to the ID. I'm using the new little formatted method on string that was added in Java 17 to just plug the ID in there. I expect that the status should be okay. Everything's fine with that. The body will have a blog post in it whose ID value matches that I. And this, by the way, the value method, takes one of those good old Hamcrest matchers that have been around for years and years. I'm using the equals Hamcrest matcher just to verify the ID I get back works. This is a somewhat slower test because I'm making those 100 network requests one by one synchronously, but so be it. Okay, now here's a test for IDs that I know don't exist. So I call the ID with 101, and I should expect the status of saying it's not found, that I won't get anything there. The post one, I created a blog post with a null ID, and I accessed the URL with that post inside it, and I expect this time the status should be in is created. The body will have the post in it whose ID will have a non-null value. I don't know exactly what it'll be, but I can print it out. Presumably it's 101. Again, everything gets reset in between the calls to that service. The put request, I'm going to go to the post that has an ID of 1, and I'm going to change the title in the body. So when I do a put request to that URL, I expect the status should be an OK. The body will have a blog post with an ID equal to 1. The ID is still there, and I'll print it just to make sure everything looks good. And finally, on the delete, I'm going to go delete post number 1, and I expect the status will be okay. This is one that didn't behave the way I was expecting. I normally expect that if I do a delete, I get back a no content. That's usually how I set up my own RESTful web services to behave. But on this particular service, it turns out that the status is a 200. It's a successful request. Now I'm going to run all those tests, and it's going to take a little while. I'll skip through it because again, it's going to make 100 individual synchronous requests. Just for the record, on this post that exists, since I'm dealing with a stream anyway, let me do a parallel on that and see if it improves the situation. The parallel probably gave me a 10-time improvement in speed because all of these tests are independent of each other, and the response gets reset every time. I mean, so it's not really changing anything. I can certainly do these in parallel. So that's nice to know. So at any rate, that will go ahead and do all of my individual ID accesses in parallel. That's very nice. Okay. Now that I know how the service behaves in a lot more detail than just telling me the endpoints, now it's time to go to the HTTP interfaces. What you see here is a portion of the reference documentation for Spring Boot 3, well, 3.1, the current version of Spring Boot. And you see it introduces this idea of HTTP interfaces. The concept is that you just make an interface and you put in your methods that have various annotations on it, like get exchange, post exchange, put exchange, etc., etc. And if there's any variables to deal with, in the URL, you can make those path variables or request params, whatever you need to do, and Spring will implement all that code. So you saw I just used the web client manually and put in all the detail of how to write that code. Here I'm going to do it by letting Spring generate the actual implementation for me. Okay, now there's two parts to this. One part is you put in all the methods in the interface with the proper annotation. You could see that those URLs are relative URLs. They're relative to the base. So I also need a bean to create the web client itself. And that goes in here. Now they're showing some boilerplate here, which I think makes more sense if you see it in practice. So let me show you that. The last thing I'll show you before I go to the code is there's also an annotation called HTTP Exchange, which lets you set a path that all of the individual methods will use. And you can even set the accept header if you want, but I'm good on that. So let's take a look. So what I have here is an interface called JSON placeholder service, and I did use the HTTP Exchange annotation to say all of my requests are going to go to /posts. So here's a simple get to retrieve them all. Here's a get that takes an ID. Now this one actually introduces a bit of a problem. You can return an optional. There's many different types that this supports for return types, but it may not behave the way I want. So we'll get to that in a moment. The create takes the blog post in the request body, and I decided to make it return a response entity so I could check the headers too, make sure everything looks the way I expect. The put exchange is going to take the path variable for the ID and the blog post in the body, and the delete just takes the ID and returns void. All that is pretty standard, pretty normal for a RESTful web service. Now, where do we put that boilerplate code? In a simple Spring Boot application, the class with the main method in it, in this case called HTTP Interfaces Demo Application, has this main method, is annotated with Spring Boot Application. Spring Boot Application is annotated with Spring Boot Configuration, means it's a config class that declares one or more bean methods and other stuff. In other words, I can put the bean I need right in here. Now there are other ways to do this, but here's what I did. I made a bean called JSON placeholder service. Again, I don't really care about the name of the bean. I just want there to be one in here. It's going to return an instance of that interface that I just defined. It'll actually return a bean that implements that interface. So this first step will be doing things the easy way without worrying about error handling. I'm just going to call the create factory method on web client. It's got a static factory method that takes the base URL and creates it. Now, create here is actually a shorthand for calling the builder API.base URL and even calling .build at the end of it. See, I didn't have to call .build either. This will create the web client for me. And in this particular case, that's all I need. The rest of this is kind of boilerplate, generating the service proxy factory based on that client, and then calling create client on the factory using the service. This is just copy and paste code right out of the documentation. You might notice, by the way, that the only custom parts of this are the base URL and the interface name. Sooner or later, I expect those to simply be properties in the application.properties file, and the rest is boilerplate will be created for us. But for the moment, I'll go with that. So there are both of the pieces. I created the web client, and I have the interfaces to work with. Now let's look at the test class. Here's the test. I'm just going to do a regular Spring Boot test, and I'll auto wire in that service. The getter just invokes get posts, and I should get back 100 of them, and I'll print the first one just to see that they're okay. But of course, if I don't get back 100, it's going to fail anyway. Ones that exist, let's use the same mechanism as in the other one. I'll put in all the IDs from 1 to 100. I'll operate this stream in parallel. For each one, I'm going to get the post for that ID, of course, and assert that it's present and that its ID matches the I that I submitted. Should be all fine. For posts that don't exist, at this stage, I can't do anything fancy, and in fact, this is where I'm going to get a problem that I'm going to have to fix by doing some error handling. The problem here is that get post with an ID that doesn't exist does not return an empty optional. You may have noticed up here, I get back my optional and it's complete, but down here I was hoping for an empty optional. I did not get an empty optional. Instead, you get a web client response exception. You get an exception, which our Spring turned into a web client response exception because I am using the web client. Okay, that's not what I want, but I can verify that that happens using JUnit 5's assert throws method, and we'll come back to this. Now, to create a post, I instantiate it with a null ID and just put some sample data in here. I invoke create post, and I should get back a status code that is equal to an HTTP status created. That's from AssertJ. I'll print it out. I'll get the body and say the body's not null, and I could even see the ID, which is not null as well. It should all be fine. For an update, I'm going to make a new post, but this time I'm going to pick an existing ID. So that ID of 1 is already in there. I'll make a post. I'll call update post on it. I'll print it out. I'll check the ID. I'll check the new title. I'll check the new body. Everything should be fine here. And for the delete, I'm just going to invoke it and make sure that it works okay and that I'm fine with that. Now, I could run all these tests. In fact, let me run all the tests on both of them merely by doing a Gradle test here. And you should see that while it's going to take a few moments, but at least running those streams in parallel is going to speed it up. And all of the tests have passed. Everything looks good. In fact, I can look at the output here of the Gradle response. And there are my 3 test classes. The default one just does a context loaded, but I have 6 tests in both of the individual ones, and they all work just fine. We're good. Now, what about that error handling? That's a bit of an annoyance. Okay, several people, by the way, on Dan Vega's videos in the comments asked about how you would do error handling on that. Let's go back to the documentation for a moment. In the documentation, they talk about the method parameters you could get in here. Dan uses a request header annotation in order to put some headers inside his request. So just letting you know, there's lots of things you could do with this. You could play around with return values, returning a mono or returning HTTP headers or flux or mono or response entity, all of those. Here's the part on exception handling, and this is kind of all they say. They say that web client will return that web client response exception for all 4XX and 5XX status codes. So to customize this, you could put in, when you create the builder, a default status handler to say, on this type of error, here's what to do with it. Now, they're not showing a lot of detail here. There's not much. They say for more details and options, such as suppressing error status codes, see the Java docs of default status handler and web client.builder. Yeah, don't get your hopes up. Here is default status handler in web client.builder, and it doesn't really say much. I'll simply point out before I use it that the arguments are a predicate wrapped around the HTTP status code. So we could say, oh, the status code is, we need a Boolean. If the status code is this, return true. If it's not this, return false. And then a function that transforms the client response into a mono that wraps around the exception handling. So those are the arguments to default status handler. Okay, so far so good. Now, let me go back to this, and what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to switch branches to one that already has this code implemented in it. Okay, now what I've done here is on the bean to get the JSON placeholder service. Now I can't do that trivial create anymore. Now I actually have to use builder. So here I'm using the builder method, which will return that web client.builder. So this is another one of those static factory methods. There's the base URL, and at the bottom I'm going to call build. But in between, it's time to play around with that default status handler. So in this case, the predicate is going to be if the HTTP status code is an error. So that'll return true if I get back an error code and false otherwise. And then the second argument, remember, is this function that takes in a client response and returns a mono of throwable. So here is a client response, and I'm going to convert the body to a mono of type string and then flat map it of all things. Yeah, because here the body, this body is the string, I'm going to convert it to a mono wrapped around the exception. So I'm going to take that exception that I get and do something with it. So if we get an error, I want to throw this web client response exception that has the status code in it, and then here is my string data on the charge of conduct unbecoming, we find you guilty as charged. I'll throw in the headers and the body and the default character set, it looks complicated, but it's basically just using the proper constructor from Web Client Response Exception. But here's the good part. What I also have in here is client advice. Client advice for a REST controller is a way of associating an exception handler with a status code. So one of the neat features in Spring Boot 3 is that when you do an exception handler for a particular exception, again, it becomes the argument to the method, you can return this thing called a problem detail. Problem detail is a class that maps to the so-called RFC 7807 problem detail. Dan's got a whole video about that. So does, by the way, Craig Walls, the author of Spring in Action. He's got a video about that as well. So all I'm using is a static factory method called forStatus and detail that says when we get this web client response exception, give me back a not found and put the body in there. So I just want to serialize the data back out, and I want a not found on that. So if I look at the test now, let me go back to the test here. You'll see that on a test, on a post for an ID that does not exist, now I am going to get that, say that this does throw that exception, but what I wind up in with the status code is a not found. I'll print the headers just so you could see them and assert that the status text, includes the string conduct unbecoming. And now let me run all these tests again. You can see I have some logging going on. So I log the fact I'm doing a GET request to 101 like this. And then there's all those headers that includes like the content type is JSON data, etc. And at the bottom, you could see there is on the charge of conduct unbecoming, we find the defendants guilty as charged. And everything passed. So that's something. It's not phenomenal in terms of error checking. I could do a lot more, but it's pretty good, and it does allow you to avoid writing all that web client code. It generated all that web client code simply from the interface. That's all you had to do. Now let's get to the thing you're really waiting for. What crimes have been committed?
Yes, I am guilty. Guilty of love. In the first degree.
All right, first of all, there have been several crimes, and those crimes were committed by the defendant, which I'm afraid is me.
What a twist!
The first crime, of course, is wearing an NCIS hat when the title of the video dealt with CSI. Yeah, you thought I wasn't going to bring that up, right? You thought that I'd ignored it at the beginning. Maybe you wouldn't notice. Yeah, I noticed, and I'm sure you noticed as well. Yeah, that one's not good. I'm guilty there. Okay. The second crime is on that charge of code conduct unbecoming.
On the charge of conduct unbecoming a United States Marine, the members find the accused.
And despite what that error message says, I'm going to claim that, no, I'm okay on that one. I think I did okay on that. I think Dan did fine as well. But that brings me to my third crime, and this is the serious one. The crime here is that, as you may have discovered, this entire video is one long, complicated way of trying to ride Dan Vega's coattails, trying to leverage this video on the heels of Dan's successful YouTube channel. And by that measure, hopefully gain more subscribers and more watch time and all of that. And for that, only you can be the true judge. So let me know what you think. Thank you for watching this. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.